how much difference in productive output is there between people? Because if there's a tremendous degree of difference in productive output between people, then increasing your ability to predict someone's performance, even by some relatively small increment, might have massive economic utility. You know, if let's say the top 10% of your people are 50 times as productive as the bottom 10% of your people, then shifting your ability to predict up so that you have more of those extremely high performing people or less of the extremely low performing people might more than pay for itself from an economic perspective, even though your predictor doesn't have that massive amount of power. Well, and that actually happens to be the case. So back in 1968, there was a guy named Walter Mischel, and he's a social psychologist, he reviewed the personality literature up to that point and concluded that the typical personality measure only predicted the typical performance measure at about 0.2. And that's actually remained relatively stable. I would say it's a little higher than that. It's probably 0.25, especially if you do things like correct for measurement error and so forth. And what Mischel said was, because it's only 0.25, let's say, you square that, that's 5% of the variance, you leave 95% of the phenomena unexplained, you might as well not even bother measuring personality. And so that actually killed the field of personality from a psychometric perspective for about 25 years, really until about the early 1990s, when people woke up and thought, wait a minute, what are the typical effect sizes in other domains of prediction? And then they found out that, well, the 0.20 correlation that was typical of personality prediction was actually pretty damn good by social sciences or health sciences standards. Like, it doesn't sound good when you just think about it as an absolute measure, because it leaves 95% of the phenomena unexplained. But when you compare it to other things that people consider of reasonable magnitude, then it turns out that personality psychologists are doing just fine. And then also in the 1990s, and I'll show you some of this, there were economic calculations done. And so one of the calculations would be, well, imagine that maybe you took 20 companies and you did a distribution of the productivity of their employees. It's a hard thing to do because you have to measure their productivity. It's like, how the hell do you do that, right? With salespeople, you can measure sales. That's pretty straightforward. With lawyers, you can measure hours billed. Like, there are some occupations where the performance measure is sort of built into the job. But if you're a manager in the mid-level of a large corporation, how the hell can you tell how productive you are? So there's a measurement problem on the productivity measurement end as well as the performance prediction end. And it's a very intractable problem. And the way that people often do that is by saying, well, let's say you're a manager in the mid-level of a corporation. How do we determine how productive you are? Well, we might ask you to compare your work productivity with your peers, maybe construct up a questionnaire asking about your efficient use of time and so forth. And then we might get your peers to do the same thing to you. We might get your supervisors to do the same thing to you. And we might get your subordinates to do the same thing to you. And then aggregate across all those measures and infer that aggregate opinion actually constitutes a valid measure of productivity. You actually don't know, right? Because that assumes that what you're doing, that your peers and your supervisors and so forth are rating, is actually related in some positive manner to the bottom line of the company, and you actually can't figure that out. This is actually, I think, why large companies start to become unstable, is because if there's enough layers between the operations of the people in the tiers of the corporation and the real outcome measure, which is basically profit, because that's what we've got, then the relationship between your activity as a manager and the productivity of the company starts to become increasingly blurred. And that might mean that you're working as hard as you can on something that's actually going to cost the company money. So you would actually be much more productive from a profit perspective if you just didn't go to work at all. And that happens a lot in large corporations, because you never know, especially if there's a lot of steps that have to be undertaken in a process before you can test the product in the market. You have no idea if you're wasting time and resources. You just can't tell. So the performance measurement issue is a very, very complicated one. We haven't talked about it that much, but I give you kind of a brief overview of it now. What you really want to do is have multiple sources of information about performance and aggregate across them. And if you can use real-world measures that are tied to income generation, so much the better, because you have to use something as your gold standard, right? You have to say at some point, well, we're going to define this as reality when it comes to performance. And in a free market economy, roughly what you do there is you say that, well, profit is the proxy for productivity. And that isn't the same thing it isn't the same thing as saying that profit is productivity. That's not the same thing. It's saying that at some point you have to decide what you're going to accept as a measure of productivity, because otherwise there's no point in even talking about it. And you can't just not talk about productivity if you're running an organization, because the organization doesn't exist unless it produces something that will keep it going. And generally that happens to be money. So anyways, it's very complicated, all of this. And I was also curious, because I'm curious, I guess, is to find out what would happen if I took a measure that was derived in the lab and then tried to launch it out in the actual real world environment, tried to market and sell it. And now that was very informative, because I presume that we developed tests, which I'll talk to you about, that were actually pretty good at predicting performance, managerial performance, for example, administrative performance. We got ours of upwards of 0.6, which is, really bloody impressive. So we could tell employers, look, if you use our tests, we can increase the probability that you'll hire an above average employee from 50-50 to 80-20. And the economic benefit of that will be staggering. And I'll show you the calculations that enable that sort of prediction to be made. And you might think, well, and this is what you do think if you're naive about producing something of value. You might think, well, if you can produce something that's of self-evident economic value, selling it will be a snap. And that is so wrong. You just cannot believe it. So one of the things we found, which was really mind-boggling to me, was that you could make a case that the probability that a company will use a test that predicts performance, the probability that they will use the test is inversely related to the accuracy of the test, which basically means that the less accurate tests are easier to sell. And you think, well, why the hell would that be? How in the world would it possibly be that corporations would rather buy tests that don't work than tests that do work? And that is what they do, because really what they do buy is the Myers-Briggs. Right? That sells about 1 million units a year. And the Myers-Briggs has zero predictive utility with regards to performance prediction. So why do people use it? Oh, here's one reason. It doesn't hurt anybody's feelings. Everybody wins, right? And so then you think, well, do corporations really care whether or not everybody wins when they're being tested? And the answer to that is yes, much more often than you would think. So we hit all sorts of barriers. That was one. The problem with tests that work is that most of the people who take them don't do very well on them. And then the other problem is that people aren't good at statistical reasoning at all. They're really, really bad at it. And so, for example, they don't know the difference between a percentage and a percentile. So a percentage is, if you get 40% on a test, it means you got 40% of the questions right. If you are at the 40th percentile in the distribution of test scores, it means that you perform better than 40% of the people. That's actually not too bad, right? But you'll think, no, that's not 40 percentile, that's 40%, and then you'll think that you failed. And so one of the things we found, for example, was that when we were marketing the tests to mid-level managers who had some say at least on whether or not they would be used, the first thing they would say is, well, I want to do the test. And the thing you say about that is, no, you don't, because this is derived statistically. You can't validate the test on the basis of your opinion about its applicability in your case. But you can't have that conversation. That isn't going to go anywhere, because they say, well, I'd never give a test to my employees that I hadn't taken myself. It's like, okay, so then you think, well, you're a typical manager. You're going to score at the 50th percentile. You are not going to be happy about that, because you want to score at the 90th percentile, because you confuse percentiles and percentages, and also because you don't notice that if you're doing better than 50% of the managers, that's actually pretty damn good. Question.
You talked about the 50th percentile.
Yeah.
50th percentile in relation to what? Is it just conscientiousness? And if so, can you be too conscientious? Is there an optimal personality profile?
That's a good. I'll answer that as I go through this. Okay. So that was often a dead starter right there. And then the other thing we'd find, this was cool too. Oh, horrible, but cool. So imagine a large corporation, and you go in and you try to make a sales pitch to someone, and maybe they're in HR, and you say to them, look, you could use these tests. If you use it for 100 people, we'll increase your bottom line by $2 million a year. You'd think people would be jumping up and down about that. And they say, well, how much does it cost? And we say, well, it doesn't matter, because the cost to benefit ratio is what you should care about, not the cost, because they would want it, say, for $9 a test. It was like, no. If you do this for each, and I'll show you the mathematics in a bit, each person that you select with this test will bring $20,000 of extra value to your company. You're not getting that for $9. And then they say, well, wait a minute, we have a budget for testing that's limited to $9 a test. They say, well, it's going to produce $30,000 a year in revenue. They say, well, that revenue goes to another branch of the company and we won't get any credit for it. We'll just get punished because we've exceeded our budget for selection. I thought, oh yeah, never expected that to come up as an obstacle. So, so we had very well-designed products. They also took about 90 minutes because we started with a full-scale neuropsychological assessment. So we took tests of dorsolateral prefrontal cortical ability, which had before that been administered by neuropsychologists, and we computerized them. We did that back in 1993, so it was among the first attempts to do this sort of thing. And then we had a 90-minute test battery that also assessed the big five, and then you could give that to employees, and you could produce this 80-20 differential that I described. And well, then we found out, well, the test was too long. It's like, well, what do you mean? You're going to gain $30,000 a year per employee if you use this test. It's like, no, people don't want to be tested that long. It's like, okay, so you want an accurate test that doesn't discriminate against anybody, that makes everyone feel good, that's dirt cheap, and that doesn't take any time at all. It's like, well, it took us about 15 years to build one of those after we had built the original thing that actually worked. And so even then, the process of trying to introduce it into the workplace was almost impossible.